From the beginning of time, mankind has been very quick to pass the buck and place blame for our situation on other people. In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to address this issue and explore why this is systematically undermining the stability of our society. But more importantly, we're going to discuss why the followers of Messiah must not give in to this carnal tendency.
If you enjoy watching this and other great content from Jacob's Tent, download the Jacob's Tent app today. Gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Well, welcome to the Weekly Scroll. It was 5 years ago at the time of this taping that the world was just being introduced to a global pandemic that we all know as COVID-19. And during that time, fear began to grip a lot of people. And of course, we know that there were many people who succumbed to this virus. In addition, rules and regulations, some ridiculous in my opinion, and rules that you and I would not otherwise tolerate became the norm for many people all throughout the world. And to some degree, we still live with the aftermath of that very awful year. Now, I raise this issue to make a point. I'm of the view that there is a far more dangerous pandemic that is affecting the world. And this one has been around since the very beginning of time, and it continues to affect us in the most negative way to this very day. The pandemic I'm referring to is the idea that I'm a victim, and therefore, as a victim, I'm entitled to certain considerations. In the beginning, God gave mankind everything he needed to thrive. He also gave him some well-defined boundaries, specifically when it came to what trees he could eat from and which tree to avoid. Of course, man let his guard down, and that allowed the serpent to slither into the midst of the garden, and that's when he had opportunity to strike up a conversation with the woman. And it went something like this. Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So then when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. So I want you to allow me to paraphrase what we just read. The evil one came into the garden, and then he planted a thought in the woman's mind that she was a victim of sorts. Why? Because God had deprived her of knowing everything that he knows. And so who was he to deny her this wisdom? He had, in fact, told her a lie in order to keep this wisdom from her. And because God had lied to her, she was entitled to that fruit and to the benefits it would bring. Of course, she ate, and then the man foolishly followed her in this folly. So I hope you see my point. Making someone to feel they are a victim and then convincing them that because they are the victim, they're entitled to something that wasn't really theirs to have. And then when there are consequences to face, the reactions that we humans typically have is, well, it's someone else's fault. The Lord God called to Adam and he said to him, "Where are you?" And so he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat?" And then the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." Again, allow me to paraphrase. Here's what Adam said. "It's not really my fault. It's kind of your fault, God, because the woman you gave me got this whole thing started." And as for Eve's part, what did she say? "The devil made me do it." All of this kind of reminds me of this invisible intruder that used to live in our house when our kids were younger. Something would happen that required an answer as to who was responsible for it. And lo and behold, it was always this invisible guy called not me. As I said, victimhood is a pandemic because it affects most of the world's population. Our default position is to point the finger of blame at others. My situation can't be the result of my choices. It's the result of my environment. It's the result of the way I've been treated by others. In other words, victimhood tends to lay the blame at someone else's feet, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Now, this is not to suggest that there are no victims in this world, because obviously there are. There are people in this world who have been victimized by others. Take Laken Riley, for instance, the 22-year-old nursing student who was murdered by Jose Antonio Ibarra, a 26-year-old Venezuelan man who had entered the United States illegally. Laken Riley was a victim. Her family are victims, and there are many other such stories. But in today's world, those who are here illegally, some of whom are credible threats to public safety, are considered by certain politicians, judges, organizations, social justice warriors to be the victims themselves. They believe that they are unfairly being arrested and deported back to their nation of origin. In other words, the victimhood I'm referring to is not legitimate, but it's merely used as an excuse to do what I want to do. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, this program that, in my opinion, is devastating to the society, and it is an example of victimhood gone off the rails. For some time now, people have been employed not because of their skills and talents and their merit, but because of their minority classification, whether that's skin color, national origin, gender, and all those things. And we even have those situations where people feel entitled to special privileges because they are multiple genders, or they don't know exactly what gender they are. All of this is nonsense. Biological men playing as women in women's sports, and then biological women suffering for it. But because victimhood has been trendy, certain allowances are made for these quote-unquote oppressed classes. And at the same time, others are denigrated and demonized because they were not born that particular minority. In this day and time, if you're a straight white guy, you may as well be Satan himself because of who you are and where you were born. Of course, the social justice warriors will say that this is just desserts for straight white guys because how straight white guys have oppressed others in times past. And yes, it's true. There have been and still are those who embrace racism and who have oppressed others who were vulnerable and defenseless. That is and will always be wrong. But playing the victim doesn't improve our situation. The victim mentality is just going to lead to more national decline, and certainly not the utopia that some seem to believe will come if we just level out the playing field. And I want to share this example from Scripture to underscore my point. In Psalm 83 it says, "Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace and do not be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, 'Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more.' For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites." Now, here's why I read this. First of all, the psalmist continues to list other nations who conspire against God's people, who they believe to be the oppressor of the privileged nation. But he leads off this list of antagonists with Edom, and that is the descendants of Esau and Ishmael. You remember that Ishmael was born to Abraham and to Hagar. But here's what I want to point out. Both Esau and Ishmael had something in common, and that is why they align with one another and why they conspired with one another to destroy their common enemy, that is Israel. Their commonality was this: both of them felt as if Israel had taken from them, as if Israel had oppressed them and robbed them of what they felt was rightfully theirs. Kind of like the adversary telling the woman, God's holding back from you and you deserve this. However, what Esau and Ishmael thought was stolen from them was never theirs to begin with. Ishmael, at no fault of his own, was born into a situation that was destined to see Isaac inherit the blessing of Abraham. However, Ishmael is the one who made the choice to make sport of Isaac, and that is what got him and his mother a ticket out of Abraham's camp. And it would seem that from that point on, Ishmael decided to make Israel his enemy. It was never intended that Esau, a man who had no regard for the birthright, there was never intended that he be the one to carry the covenantal torch forward. That was always destined for Jacob. Yet Esau and his descendants, they were and are convinced that they were the victims. They are the victims. Here's what he said in Genesis 27. Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing. And by the way, that statement is a lie. Esau gave the birthright away because it meant nothing to him. What mattered to him was the blessing, or the stuff, you might say. He shed no tears for loss of the birthright, but he wailed and lamented at the thought of losing his stuff. Now, with that in mind, imagine what would happen today if some people were suddenly deprived of their stuff, their cell phone, their tablets, their shredded jeans that cost a small fortune. Might it be that those people would grieve over that and yet have no regard for things that are holy and sacred? No, I believe that as a nation, as a society, and a culture, we're fixated on our stuff, and we're fixated on making sure that the oppressed are taken care of. And by that, we mean giving money to special interest groups here in the United States, allowing biological men to compete against biological women. We've learned to play the victim so well that it's provoked us to think of ways to garner even more stuff. We're committed to donating funds to other nations in order to fund things like sex changes and the LGBTQ activism that is necessary to enhance in Guatemala. I'm not making that up. We donate funds to produce a DEI musical in Ireland. I'm sure you can't wait to get a ticket to that. We donate funds to irrigation canals, farming equipment, and even fertilizer, sounds good so far, used to support the unprecedented poppy cultivation and heroin production in Afghanistan. So, noting these things, it seems to be the appropriate time to read you a quote from Alexander Fraser Tytler, who was an 18th century Scottish judge, writer, and historian who spent a lot of time studying the Greek and Roman civilizations. And he famously said this: "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. And from that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship." He then continued, "The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years. Think about that. These nations have progressed through this sequence, from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back into bondage." I don't know about you, but that all sounds incredibly familiar. I believe that today many Americans feel entitled to things like free health care, entitled to abortion on demand, entitled to government-funded this and that. And as we've recently learned, some of the this and that is ridiculous, not to mention unreasonable. There are many people in this nation who believe that reparations are necessary in order to rectify the wrongs of slavery. And I realize that even touching on this subject is liable to get me in trouble with a lot of people. But I want you to hear me. No one is disputing that slavery was and is wrong. It was, it is, and this country paid a very heavy price. But today, states like California, a state that I might point out is already broken financially, are nevertheless putting forth a bill that would pay reparations to people who are not even alive during slavery. And those reparations would be paid by people who were not alive during slavery. And so I would argue that this absurdity is the consequence of a victim mentality that has gone way too far. And here's some Bible to back up this claim. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. The prophet Jeremiah reaffirms this notion, and that is that those not responsible for this sin should not be paying the consequence of that sin. And he says, everyone shall die for his own iniquity. So I want you to hear me. This really isn't about reparations or whether slavery was bad. This is about what happens to a nation when victimhood is not only embraced by some, but it's reinforced by those in power. And then what happens when those two forces intersect? It's about what happens when people with a victim mentality feel entitled to things that really aren't theirs. Now, it bears in mind that Tytler made his observations about democracies after studying the Greeks and the Romans. And it was the Romans who spent the public treasury on bread and circus. And why? To pacify the whims of the masses. And it was not long after this policy that the great Roman Empire collapsed. So then, perhaps instead of reinforcing this notion that everyone whose life isn't what they think it should be is a victim and therefore entitled to special considerations, maybe instead of that, maybe we should be teaching our children the long-held tradition of accountability, responsibility, and ownership. And by ownership, I mean owning our own choices. Maybe we should be teaching our children that they aren't entitled to a paycheck for just showing up. Because when they show up, they're going to be expected to work. I don't believe that no one's entitled to a tip for just doing their job. A tip is given for doing a job well. Now, this might come as a surprise to some, but that I just said, that's a biblical principle. We're expected to work, and we're expected to work hard, not just to produce a little fruit, but to produce a lot of fruit. And why? So that our Father in heaven can be glorified. And by the way, if the master decides to give someone who joined the job later in the day the same wage as he paid us who started at the beginning of the day, we shouldn't consider ourselves a victim and therefore entitled to more. That's not the way it's supposed to work. We shouldn't be as the world, going around looking for something to be offended about. That's what the world does. In fact, consider this. Just recently, a Long Island, New York school district was sued by a father and a local civil rights leader who claimed that the school district new mascot is a symbol of white supremacy. The complaint accused the school district of selecting the Spartans as their new mascot, despite it being, quote, racially problematic. The claim is that the ancient Greek warrior is a, quote, symbol of hate and therefore should be banned by state law. On the other hand, the suit argued that other options such as green machine, bears, owls, bulldogs, and eagles were not members of a, quote, identifiable or generally perceived protected class like the Spartans. Quote, Spartans are of the identifiable and generally perceived protected classes of white non-Hispanic in race, white in color, Greek in national origin, and Spartan or Greek in ethnicity. The suit goes on to claim that Spartans are a, quote, symbol of white supremacy because it is well known that they are known to be, quote, white warriors who conquered other people groups and, quote, enslaved indigenous people. The complaint also accuses the logo of being a symbol of hate for female enlistment in the military because, quote, ancient Spartans did not allow females to be soldiers in the military. By the way, the selection of Spartans by this school district came about because this district was forced to pick a new mascot in order to comply with a directive from the New York Education Department, one that required school districts to stop using indigenous names, mascots, and logos. The previous team mascot was the Indians. Now, I realize that it's inevitable that people are going to get offended at something you and I say or something that you and I do. And some of those people that get offended are going to play the victim, and because they feel like they're victimized, they're going to feel entitled to special privileges and considerations. But let's remember, that is the ploy of the enemy. And that's one he's used from the very beginning. You will not surely die. God's just holding stuff back from you. You're entitled to it. People are going to get offended if we take a stand for what is true. Let's face it, a lot of people got terribly offended at the Messiah. Some, hearing him speak, even walked away and refused to follow him anymore after taking offense at what he said. But that didn't stop him from speaking the truth. And so then, if we're going to offend someone, and I don't encourage offending people deliberately, but if we're going to offend someone, then it should be because we're speaking the truth. And more importantly, because we're living the truth. And here is truth. Sin's not the biggest problem facing mankind. The sin can be dealt with because through the Messiah, there is a recourse for sin. I would argue that the bigger problem is our unwillingness to take responsibility for our sin. Our inability to acknowledge that our choices, by and large, have determined our situation. No one can do anything about the environment into which they were born or how they were raised, but all of us have the choice to do something about how we go forward, how we respond, and whether we're going to choose the wide, broad path that everybody's on, the one that is ultimately going to lead to destruction. Some choose the narrow path. It's the more difficult path. And it's the one that causes us to assess ourselves and to make choices that deny ourselves. But it's the one path that leads to life. And so when the choice is before us, let's choose life. Let's not choose to be a victim. Let's not choose to feel entitled. Let's choose not to be offended about everything. But let's choose to follow the one who, well, let's put it this way. If we're going to have to choose to offend somebody, man or God, we'll have to offend man and choose to follow the one that is going to bring us peace, harmony, and prosperity and eternal life.
If you enjoyed these videos and value our content here at Jacob's Tent, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and never miss the latest info and insights from Bill and the team. Most of all, you can help us spread the message. By sharing these videos with others, you'll be helping to grow our interactive community together.